I'm very busy as a neuroscientist, but this is why I always devote a lot of time towards writing public dissemination of science, because I think it's really important. It's actually very clear to me who my audience is when I write, and that is my younger self, myself who didn't know this data at some point, but was interested and would have had my mind blown by some of these facts that I didn't know existed in the world. Happily, lots and lots of adults and older people read my books and get a lot out of it. But fundamentally, I'm writing these books for the kid who thinks, hey, I want to go into neuroscience. I'm not sure exactly what is the most interesting part to me, but here's one way of getting there.
Welcome to Brain Science, the podcast where we explore how recent discoveries in neuroscience are unraveling the mystery of how our brain makes us human. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell, and this is episode 187. My guest today is best-selling author and neuroscientist David Eagleman. Besides being a prolific writer, Dr. Eagleman has also hosted the TV series The Brain, which aired internationally. I first talked to David back in 2011 about his first book, Incognito. Today, we are talking about his latest book, LiveWired, the inside story of the ever-changing brain. This is an episode for listeners of all backgrounds, but before we jump into the interview, I want to remind you that you can find complete show notes and episode transcripts at brainsciencepodcast.com. Brain Science is produced independently and relies on the financial support of listeners like you. To learn more, please visit brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. Please feel free to send me feedback at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com or visit our fan page on Facebook. If you'd like to get show notes automatically every month, sign up for our free newsletter. Just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. There's also a link in the show notes. David Eagleman, welcome back to Brain Science. It's great to have you back on the show.
Yeah, it's great to be here again after all these years.
I thought you might start out by just telling us a little bit about yourself in terms of how did you get originally interested in neuroscience?
My father was a psychiatrist and my mother was a biology teacher. And so I think there was a lot of conversation about the brain always happening at my house, but I never thought that I'd actually go in that direction. It just didn't strike me. I wanted to be a writer. But I was in college in my last semester of my senior year. I took a neuroscience course and then I was just hooked. I just felt like I had found the thing that I wanted to do with the rest of my life.
That's it. That's a great story. I get emails from people all the time about the way they feel when they discover neuroscience, and it's kind of cool to be a part of that discovery since we share this passion for sharing it with others. Your new book, now you did become a writer because this is like the sixth book or something like that?
Yeah, eighth
okay.
Book. Yep.
So your new book, LiveWired, Inside Story of the Ever-Changing Brain. What motivated you to write this particular book?
I've written books on lots of other aspects of neuroscience, but to me, the most gorgeous, probably least talked about in terms of popular science aspect of the brain is its massive flexibility and the way that it's constantly reconfiguring every moment of your life. So with everything that you hear and experience and see and so on, you've got your 86 billion neurons and your 200 trillion connections between them, and they're just constantly reconfiguring. So now this concept of brain plasticity, this is something most everybody knows about. So I'm not implying that it's an unknown, but there's not much to talk about because there's so much mystery there. And the reason is our technology really isn't good enough to measure what's happening at the level of these very tiny connections. And so what I wanted to do in this book is distill down everything in the plasticity literature to basic principles. What do we think is actually happening under the hood with the system that's very different from, for example, what we build in Silicon Valley, where everything is about hardware and software? So I call this LiveWire to distinguish it, because it's a system that's actually changing its own circuitry on the fly. And of course, this is how we drop into the world and absorb it and come to represent our cultures and our neighbors and our friends and our parents. And half of us is other people in the end, because we absorb all this stuff, and that's who we become. So anyway, that's why I wanted to write this book.
Yeah, one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was that you took all the classic experiments about plasticity that are out there and sort of went back through them, but looked at them, like you said, from a basic principle point of view. I was wondering about the role of DNA, because that really, in some ways, is the reason why our brain needs to be flexible. Would you talk about what its role is?
Generally, the way I look at DNA now is it is the thing that sets up the system. It's the first domino that kicks off the whole show. But really, what it is setting up is a system that is LiveWired. It's building a system that will then go out and absorb the world around it. So, in other words, one of the people that I worked with in my postdoctoral fellowship was Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. And in 1953, when he and Watson discovered that structure, figured it out, he went bursting into the Eagle and Child pub and said, "We have discovered the secret of life." And my argument is that actually what they discovered was one half of the secret to life. And the other half is all around us, because it's everything that we experience in the world. That's the thing that really wires up our brains to be who we are. So the analogy I give in the book is, imagine if you were born 30,000 years ago, exactly the same DNA. Now, the question is, would you be you? Or would you, given a completely different culture and technology and language and religion and everything going on 30,000 years ago, would you be someone else entirely? And it's actually a very hard experiment to run in our heads. But the fact is, you would be someone completely different, because all of your experiences would be different. So DNA is actually not the secret to life that we thought it was. I remember in 2000, when the Human Genome Project was finally completed, we all thought this was the biggest deal. We thought, wow, now that we have the whole human genome, we're going to really understand ourselves. I don't mean to imply that it was a failure, because there's so many things that will continue to come out of it. But boy, it did not give us an understanding that we had hoped it would, because that's only a little piece of the puzzle. Now, the interesting part is that all of the changes that happen with the brain because of your experience actually can feed back down to the level of the DNA and change the genes that are getting expressed or repressed. So I just want to mention that when we think about DNA and we think about world experience, these actually intertwine in a strange way. So nowadays, when we think about the nature nurture question, it is a dead question, because we know that it is both in a way that intertwines very carefully.
Today's episode is sponsored by Green Chef, the #1 meal kit for eating well. Eating well is easier than ever with Green Chef's satisfying home-cooked dinners and options that work around your lifestyle, not the other way around. You can choose from 30 easy-to-follow recipes every week, with options from keto, paleo, and plant-powered diets, as well as meals to help you eat in a more balanced way. My favorite thing about Green Chef is the wide variety of recipes that keep me from getting into a rut. Just go to greenchef.com/ginger100 or use the code GINGER100 to get $100 off, including free shipping. That's greenchef.com/GINGER100 or the code GINGER100. When I was in medical school, and I think they're still taught this idea that the sensory and motor areas of the brain are hardwired for particular tasks. But the reality is that it is much more interesting. Can you take us through our current understanding of what's really going on?
Yeah. So, for example, with the motor system, so you've got this strip in your brain right around where you would wear headphones that has a map of the body, and it controls all these muscles of your body. And this was discovered in the 1960s. And a perfectly reasonable explanation was, okay, this is genetically pre-specified. This is the map of the human body, what a body should look like. But it turns out we pretty quickly discovered that it's not genetically pre-specified, because if you, let's say, lose an arm or you're born without legs or something like that, the map of the body reflects what's going on there. So what that means is, for example, if you lose an arm, the part in your brain that represents an arm gets taken over pretty rapidly by the neighboring areas. So what that means is it's experience dependent. It depends on the amount of activity coming in, and that's how your brain puts together from its mission control center in darkness a sense of what's going on with the body and what muscles it can drive. And so it's a very flexible system. And so, I tell the story of this dog who was born without front legs, and this dog walks bipedally on her back legs. Presumably, all dogs could do this. It's just that almost all dogs are not sufficiently motivated to do this. But this particular dog needed to get to her mother and to milk and food and so on. So she just figured out how to. So what that means is dog brains are not genetically pre-specified to drive dog bodies. Instead, it just figures out how to best control the muscles to get what it needs. And the way we do this is with motor babbling, just like we learn speech with speech babbling. And so, you look at a baby, and a baby's just moving her arms around and her legs and kicking and figuring out how the whole system works. And eventually, after some years, figures out pretty well how to drive that system. I tell the story in the book of the gentleman who has the world's record for the longest shot in archery. He doesn't have any arms. And so he uses the bow and arrow with his legs. Not that hard. He just figures out how to do it, and he really cares about it. And so he's got the world record. So it's a very flexible system. But now the part where I have personally spent most of my time in the last 10 years since we last talked, Ginger, is with the flexibility of the sensory system. My argument there is we're born with eyes and ears and nose and fingertips, and so and we just take these things for granted. We assume, oh yeah, these are the windows onto the world that we have. But in fact, when you look across the animal kingdom, you find all sorts of weird energy sources that can be picked up on, like magnetoreception, picking up magnetic field of the earth, for example, or electroreception, picking up electrical fields, or infrared or ultraviolet light, all kinds of things that you could bring in. Or even a dog who has these tremendous snouts that they pick up all kinds of smells that we're totally blind to. So I got really interested in this idea about, could we take information in through unusual pathways? And essentially the hypothesis that I started with is, however the information gets to the brain will just figure out what to do with it. And so in my laboratory, we started working on sensory substitution for people who are deaf. So for someone whose ears aren't working, and there are, by the way, 220 genetic reasons why you can go deaf, because it's a very delicate system in there. What we do is we just push the information in through a different channel. And in our case, we chose the skin. So we use patterns of vibration on the skin with multiple vibratory motors. And we capture sound and we translate it, and it works. So we originally built this as a vest with vibratory motors on it, but eventually I spun this off out of my lab as a company called Neosensory, and we managed to shrink this whole thing down to a wristband. So the wristband has vibratory motors on it, and it has a microphone built into it, and it captures sound, and it turns that into these patterns on the wrist. And people who are deaf can come to understand the auditory world around them. They can identify sounds and figure out what's going on. And what's weird is, after, let's say, 3 to 6 months, it becomes a subjective experience, just the way that you think of hearing now. When you hear the dog bark, do you feel like, oh, there's a vibration on my wrist, and I look at my wrist and I figure out, okay, that must be a dog, and I do a cognitive translation? They say, no, I'm just hearing the dog. And of course, that's the same with our ears. Our ears are just picking up sound waves at the eardrum and translating that all the way into the inner ear, and it breaks it up into different frequencies and ships it off to the brain as sets of spikes, electrochemical spikes. And that's all we're doing. We're just transferring the inner ear to the wrist, to the skin, and those spikes are then traveling up the arm and up the spinal cord into the brain, and the brain figures out how to interpret them.
And that was all inspired by the original cochlear implants. I mean, nobody thought that they would work. And the fact that they did taught us some important basic lessons that you talked about in the book.
That's right. People actually were very skeptical that cochlear implants were going to work because you're slipping a little strip of electrodes into the inner ear. And people thought, okay, this is close, but it's not quite what your natural biological sense organs are doing under natural circumstances. So maybe this isn't going to work. I mean, as recently as, I don't know, 30 years ago, people were quite skeptical that this was ever going to happen. But actually, the kind of thing I'm talking about was inspired even before that by, for example, there was a very famous paper in 1969 in Nature where a scientist named Paul Bocchi-Rita put blind people into a modified chair where he had a solenoid grid that would poke them in the back. So imagine a 20 by 20 grid of these little things that can poke in and out. So he had a camera set up, a video camera, and whatever the camera was seeing would get translated into poking your back. And people who were blind could get pretty good at understanding what was in front of the camera, just predicated on what they felt on their skin of their back. And this was quite remarkable because, in some sense, I mean, we all played these games as kids where, for example, your mother draws something on your back, something like that, and you guess what it is. But it turns out that however the information gets to the brain can do its best to figure it out. And so it's quite interesting. And what I've discovered since that time, by the way, is that this idea actually reaches back to the late 1800s. There was in Poland in the 1890s a scientist who took blind people and took a photodiode, just a single photodiode, which could tell whether it was light or dark in different degrees, and translate that into sound. So a blind person would walk around with this on a helmet, and it would go wee when it was light, and it would be silent when it was dark, and everywhere in between. And he was able to show that blind people could start to learn how to navigate with this. And so this idea of pushing information into the brain via unusual channels is what got me really interested. And that's what led to what we're doing with neosensory. And now, by the way, we're on wrists all over the world. And what we're doing right now actually is organizing with different deaf schools all over the world to get these in. And for example, a philanthropist recently just donated a lot of money to get this into these different deaf schools. And so it's really lovely for me to see this kind of thing come out of the lab and actually get implemented on the ground.
Another one of those classic experiments that you talked about with a slightly different twist was the one where they blindfold the sighted person when they're learning Braille. And the real kicker there was how fast people's cortex would change. Could you talk a little bit about what that tells us?
So some colleagues of mine at Harvard did this experiment. What has been known is that if you go blind, the visual cortex doesn't remain visual. It gets taken over by hearing, by touch, things like that. And what my colleagues were able to demonstrate, much to their own surprise, was how rapidly this can happen. So if you take a sighted person and you put them in the scanner and you blindfold them tightly, what you see is that the visual cortex at the back of the head starts responding to signals of hearing and touch within about an hour, which is much faster than anyone would have guessed. Now, obviously, it's not growing new connections, new axons from the neurons into that area. Instead, one thing that we know is that the brain is heavily cross-wired. So you have neurons from the auditory cortex and from areas involved in touch and so on. And these are reaching all around. But what happens is when there's no more visual information coming in, suddenly the brain says, oh, I guess there's no more visual information coming in. That's fine. I guess we'll start taking over that territory that is otherwise going to be lying fallow. Anyway, it turns out that this can happen really rapidly. And what my student and I realized as soon as we read that paper was, gosh, the problem is that the planet rotates into darkness 12 hours out of every 24. That means that the visual cortex would be in danger every night of getting taken over by hearing and touch and other things. And so what we realized is this is actually the basis for dreaming. The reason we dream at night is because these very sophisticated mechanisms in the brain that are hardwired in there every 90 minutes or so become active and slam activity back into the visual cortex. And if you look up the circuitry for dreaming, you'll see that it only goes into the visual cortex and that's it. Because it's the visual cortex, we of course interpret it as visual. And presumably the content of dreams has to do with whatever synapses are hot from whatever you've experienced in the daytime. So the point is, you get this activity that's slamming back into the visual cortex every 90 minutes, and we interpret it as seeing stuff. And because the brain is a great storyteller, we impose narrative on top of that. And we wake up and we say, oh my gosh, I just had this weird experience. But the point is, it is the visual system's way of defending itself against takeover from the neighboring areas. And so we've now researched that. And for example, we compared very carefully 25 different species of primates and looked at how flexible their brains are, how plastic their brains are, and how much dream sleep they get every night as measured by rapid eye movement, REM. And so it turns out this correlates perfectly, which is to say a species like the gray mouse lemur, which is not particularly plastic and it learns how to walk fast and it weans quickly and reaches adolescence quickly, has very little dream sleep. But at the other end of the spectrum, Homo sapiens, we have these very long infancies. It takes us a long time to figure stuff out, like how to walk, and we wean, and we have very long time to adolescence and so on. And we have lots and lots of dream sleep, more than any other species.
I want to take just a moment to remind you about my favorite sponsor, Text Expander. This is a tool that allows you to create short snippets that can expand into any sort of content that you have to type repeatedly. Text Expander is available on Mac, Windows, Chrome, iPhone, and iPad. I literally use it every day. Brain Science listeners can get 20% off their first year. Just visit textexpander.com/podcast to learn more about Text Expander. That's textexpander.com/podcast for 20% off your first year. And don't forget to tell them that you heard about it on Brain Science. Of course, not all parts of the brain are equally flexible. What determines which parts are going to be fixed or hardwired and which ones are going to stay flexible throughout life?
I propose a new hypothesis about this in the book, which is I think that it has to do with the stability of the data coming in. And what I mean by that is take something like the visual system. The visual system is not particularly plastic because it learns at the beginning that you have a certain number of orientations in the world and a certain number of angles and a certain number of colors. And that's really it. Like I'm talking about the primary visual cortex figures out the world and says, okay, got it. This is what it is. And so it's quite difficult to make changes there. But something like your motor system or your sensory system, those remain plastic your whole life. Why? Well, you grow from a baby to an adult. And so there's lots of changes. But, as you go through life, you get fatter, you get thinner, you sprain your ankle for a while, you break your leg for a while. There's all kinds of changes. You get on a pogo stick, you get on a bicycle, you jump on a trampoline. And so these systems have variable data coming in. And so they just remain plastic for a longer time. So they remain flexible. So anyway, that's my suggestion for how we can understand that. And even if you look, let's say, just within the visual system, you find that areas like primary visual cortex, V1, really gets crystallized early on. But other parts of the visual system, let's say as you follow down along the bottom of the temporal lobe, you've got these areas that code for symbols and signs and faces and things like that. And that remains flexible your whole life. Even when you're 100 years old, you can still learn a new face and learn a new company logo and things like that.
One of the things that I found most fascinating about your book was your take on memory. Talk about memory and how that fits into this live wiring concept.
Yeah, memory is an interesting thing because we've all gotten so used to talking about memory in terms of computers and so on. And there's a mixture of this simple word, because in a computer, whatever zeros and ones you're putting in, that is exactly what gets retained. But of course, human memory is totally different from that. We actually, of course, don't remember most of what happens in our lives. We write down the things that are very salient, of course, but most of the things just get forgotten. They come through the system and right back out. What the last 60 years has taught us is that memory is many different things. You have short-term and long-term memory. And within long-term memory, you have those things that are explicit. In other words, things that I can tell you about. Oh, this is my address. This is what I did yesterday, and so on. And then you've got lots of implicit memory, things that I know how to do, like ride a bicycle, but I can't possibly explain it. And even within that, you've got many different subcategories. And it turns out the reason we figured all this out, we as a community over the last X number of decades, is mostly because of nature's cruel experiments where you have people with brain damage and they lose a particular kind of memory. Anyway, memory is a fascinating area, but this is one of the things at the heart of brain plasticity. In other words, the reason the brain changes is to keep track of things, presumably for the purpose of doing better and better future simulations. So, in other words, the reason we write things down is so that we can make better simulations of what's going to come next. But one of the things that I propose in the book is that we as a community, we've concentrated almost entirely on changes at the synapses between neurons, the connection points between neurons. And in fact, the entire field of artificial intelligence, artificial neural networks, everything is about, okay, here's neurons, they connect, you dial the strength of that synaptic connection. But in fact, when we really look, we find plasticity at all different levels. And the only reason we all talk about synaptic plasticity is because that's at the limits of what we can measure. And so we are like the drunks looking for the keys under the streetlight. That's all we have access to. But in fact, when activity passes through the brain, you have changes not only to synapses, but also the receptors that are expressed on the neurons, the distribution of those receptors, the internal biochemical milieu, and the way those cascades change, all the way down to the DNA, as I mentioned before, and what's called the epigenome, proteins that stick around the DNA itself and cause certain genes to get expressed more and others to get suppressed. And so all of these things are important examples of plasticity that are happening. And all of this underlies what we think of as memory.
Tell us why just thinking of the synapses doesn't work. Why that's not enough.
The reason that quickly runs out of steam and doesn't work is because a system will get quickly overloaded and turn into memory mud when you try to put, let's say, 50 years of memories into it by just changing synapses. You eventually run out of space and you run out of everything starts becoming muddy. But that's not what actually happens with humans. What happens with humans is that older memories become more stable. One of the stories I tell in the book is Albert Einstein, when he died on his deathbed in a Princeton hospital, was speaking in German, and all his last words were in German. And unfortunately, the nurse didn't speak German, so we don't know what his last words were. But the point is, this actually happens quite a lot, where people revert to their first language as they're on their deathbed. And this is because as you get older and older, you forget what you did last week and last month and last year, but you remember your childhood just fine. This is one of the first rules in neurology, is that older memories are more stable. And you can't get this kind of rule out of a basic thing where you're just changing synapses in artificial neural network. Instead, I propose that the fast changing parts of the brain are changing the slower parts. If they continue having a particular activity, then the slower parts, which are more conservative, say, okay, wow, well, I'm starting to believe that because I'm seeing that over and over. And then there's even more conservative parts that are working even more slowly beyond that, and so on down the line. And that's how the whole system is actually working. The main thing is, for I guess really since the 1970s, since the notion of change at a synapse was first proven experimentally, for 50 years now, we as a field have said, oh, this is great. We're going to really understand memory. And everyone who studies long-term potentiation or depression at synapses starts off their talk saying this is a candidate mechanism for memory. And then it just becomes accepted as, okay, that's what this is. This is the heart of memory. And as soon as we understand this, we'll understand it. But what's weird is that we still have, I feel like we're not that much farther along than we were 50 years ago. And so there's so much to be understood about how things get written down and why. One of the proposals that I make is that really the way to understand all these different types of change in the brain that I just mentioned is to understand it as a pace layer system. And All that means is you have things that are happening at different paces. So this is an idea that Stuart Brand proposed for thinking about cities a long time ago. He said, look, in a city, you've got some things that change really rapidly, like the fashion. And you have some things that change more slowly, like which businesses are in which buildings. This is the restaurant here, and this is the bank here, and whatever. And then even more slowly, you have changes in, let's say, the buildings themselves. And then even more slowly, you have changes in the governance of the city, and all the way down to things like nature. The river is flowing through the city here, but a million years ago it was flowing through over here. And so you've got all these different layers that are happening at different time scales, and they all interact with one another, interestingly. And so I propose a neural pace layer way of thinking about this, which is you've got these changes that happen rapidly all the way to more slowly. And this is really the way to think about it. I'll just mention in answer to your question, the thing that I think doesn't get talked about enough is the current simple idea of saying, oh, you just change synapses.
Do you want better safety and privacy when you're browsing the internet? If so, it's time to consider a VPN or virtual private network. There are many VPN services out there, but NordVPN is one of the top rated and also the fastest. With easy one-click access, you can log in via servers in 59 countries, and your internet provider can't throttle your bandwidth. I consider NordVPN a must-have when I travel and have to use public Wi-Fi. Just go to nordvpn.com/brain science to get a 2-year plan plus a bonus gift with a huge discount. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee if it's not for you. That's nordvpn.com/brain science. Why is it important to understand that human brains don't store memories the way computers do?
Generally, it's that when we want to address and understand disorders of memory with humans, we just have to make sure that we've set our target correctly, because otherwise, if we get distracted by computer memory and think, oh, yeah, I totally got this, we don't understand anything about amnesias and the decline of memory and Alzheimer's and things like that. So this is why it's critical to actually understand your target.
Right. And you had that great example from, I guess it's from The Matrix, when the guy says he's just going to upload the instructions for how to fly the helicopter, and why that wouldn't really work in people, because everything we learn is based on what we already know. You can't just throw something in there.
Yeah, exactly. This is the fantasy that we've all had, is this thing, oh, can I just upload this whole history book that I need to read for the exam tomorrow? Can we just somehow upload it? But yeah, exactly as you said, the argument I make is that everything about who you are comes about from your particular individual experiences. And so when you think about some historical event or how to fly the B-212 helicopter or whatever, it's all a matter of who you are. So you might think about flying the helicopter as, oh yeah, this is like riding a horse, and if I just pull back this way and blah, blah. And I might think about it as, oh yeah, this is like a motorcycle, and if I just lean this way and do that, and so on, based on our personal experiences. And so I think uploading data like that might actually be possible someday, but you'd have to do system identification first and really understand essentially everything about your brain and everything about my brain, and then individualize the upload that way. But there's no single sort of dump that you could just do like a software patch.
David, I know that you're pretty tight for time today, so I just want to ask you, what else would you like to share so that we don't accidentally miss whatever else you feel is the really most important?
I end the book talking about my excitement for building new kinds of technologies as we come to understand LiveWire. And this will probably be my next company in a few years, which is how to get away from just thinking about everything as hardware and software. The way this works in Silicon Valley and worldwide, of course, is engineers get praised for being trim and efficient and saying, okay, look, I've got this very clean hardware layer, then I can put software on it, blah, blah, blah. But it's not at all what is going on in this incredibly futuristic technology that we're all carrying around on our shoulders. We wouldn't even believe that any of this is possible, except that we have an existence proof of it.
Us.
Us, exactly. And so my big interest is, can I set off down this different path of really trying to figure out how to build LiveWire, meaning a system that reconfigures itself? For example, I have to buy a new cell phone every couple of years because, it gets out of date and it gets too old to be able to do stuff. And so wouldn't it be great if my cell phone were just constantly changing its own circuitry so it was always modern? Or at the end of the book, I make all kinds of suggestions about what if you could build buildings that readjust themselves. So let's say there's an event happening at the building and many more people are going to the restroom. So you just grow more toilets and the plumbing and so on. I mean, that sounds crazy, except that this is what our bodies do all the time. We're constantly growing new blood vessels, and it's easy for the brain to just say, oh, okay, there's more needed here. We'll put this here, put that there. Why couldn't you make a live wired building that's actually changing itself? It says, oh, you need more kitchen space. That's cool. I'm just going to grow the kitchen. All of this sounds crazy now, but I suspect in 150 years, this is just going to be standard stuff.
What advice would you give to a student coming along now who wants to perhaps get into neuroscience?
Here's exactly what I would say. It's that it's a huge field now. I was lucky enough to get into it when it was a much smaller field. But the key is there's so many different things you could do in neuroscience. I think the most important thing to do is to read broadly and listen to podcasts like this one and watch videos on YouTube and so on, and really pay careful attention to your gut and see what resonates the most. Because otherwise, you can end up in graduate school and end up in some lab and have a perfectly good thesis and so on. But if you want to do the thing that's going to get you up in the morning and you think is the greatest thing you've ever had the opportunity to participate in, it's worth spending a lot of time just doing a gut check and thinking, okay, that is the thing that really makes me jump out of bed.
And work those long hours.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, this is why, I'm very busy as a neuroscientist, but this is why I always devote a lot of time towards writing public dissemination of science, because I think it's really important. It's actually very clear to me who my audience is when I write, and that is my younger self, myself who didn't know this data at some point, but was interested and would have had my mind blown by some of these facts that I didn't know existed in the world. Happily, lots and lots of adults and older people read my books and get a lot out of it. But fundamentally, I'm writing these books for the kid who thinks, hey, I want to go into neuroscience. I'm not sure exactly what is the most interesting part to me, but here's one way of getting there. And the other thing is, unfortunately, this is still as true as it was when I was a student. Science is often so poorly taught because,
Oh, gosh. We certainly are seeing the consequences of that right now, aren't we?
yeah. But I don't even think that's new. I suspect it's better now than it used to be. But when I was in school, all my science teachers thought, okay, look, we're obligated to teach this series of facts, and we need to have this outline and this. And so you would just get a core dump of facts. The most boring class I ever took was biology, which I hate to say because I'm a biologist now and I am so in love with biology now. But boy, it is just by chance that I managed to circumvent how terrible my education was in biology, because it was memorizing genus and species and phylum and so on. None of the good stuff. So anyway, that's why I write, is so that young people will at least have a chance to see, oh my gosh, here's how I behave in the world and why, and here's what's happening under the hood.
So, a question that I know is going to be in the minds of my older listeners. Okay, we've heard all this about brain plasticity. And of course, for those of us who are getting older, we want to know, how do we keep this going? Do you have any words of wisdom?
Yes. Yeah. It turns out there's very clear data on this. And it's wonderful because the answer is challenging the brain. What the brain is trying to do is develop an internal model of the world and say, okay, I got it. I know how this works. And then it doesn't have to do any more change. that's all it's trying to do, is get to a point where it doesn't have to change anymore. And one of the interesting things about the pandemic has been that all of us got knocked off our hamster wheels back in early 2020. And we've had a lot of brain changes since then, just predicated on needing to figure out what the heck's going on and how to get food in our fridge and what we want to do with our jobs and our lives and how to do things on Zoom and so on. But the key is, as one gets older, one has to try harder and harder to seek novelty, to avoid one's own dogma, to figure out how to celebrate possibility and try new things constantly, and new things that are in between the levels of frustrating but achievable. So it can't be something that's too easy. And obviously, if it's too difficult, it doesn't mean anything to the brain. But so people will ask me all the time, what about, should I do Sudoku or should I do crossword puzzles? The answer is sure, until you get good at it, and then stop it and do something else. So that's the key. And one of the easy pieces of advice I always give to people, and it sounds stupid, but it's important, which is, okay, first of all, if you're wearing a watch, put your watch on the other hand, start brushing your teeth with your other hand, rearrange your office, every few months, push your desk to somewhere new, whatever, put your mouse on the other side of the keyboard, put the printer over here, the paper's over there, take the paintings off your wall and just swap them around in your house. All this stuff is easy to do, but what it adds up to is allowing your brain to get itself off the path of least resistance and having to at least notice things about the world. One thing that I always try to do is drive a different route home from work every day, because otherwise you become an automatized zombie where you're doing the same thing every day. So these are all the things that we know from studies, by the way, are massively important, is to keep the brain active and challenged.
And so we see, if you take somebody like, say, Eric Kandel, who was certainly a role model of a healthy elder, he was always learning new things.
That's exactly right.
And swimming.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, physical exercise is really important. It's interesting. So yeah, someone like Eric is a great example, but it's funny because even if you're a great scientist, you can, as you get older, sort of fall into routine and say, okay, this is my special. I'm going to poke aplesias all day long. And so, it's important to be making sure you do other stuff all the time. Francis Crick was, obviously he, became super famous for discovering the structure of DNA as a young person, but he was constantly doing new things. He got very interested in consciousness and meaning, and he would read the scientific journals each week back in the day when they were paper magazines that arrived on your desk. He would read those and he would send handwritten letters to people who had written those papers and say, I have a suggestion. I think you should try this experiment, and you do this with the monkey and you train him to do that and you measure this. He was amazing. And he was doing that well into his 80s. Unfortunately he died. I think he was 86 when he passed away, but he was sharp as a tack until the day he passed away because he was constantly using his brain. One of the most inspiring things for the years that I overlapped with him at the Salk Institute, the thing that was so incredible was that whenever we had a speaker come, he'd sit there in the front row. And sometimes, because he was getting a little elderly, he would drop his head like he was falling asleep. And I thought, oh, there's the cost of senescence. He's falling asleep there. And then suddenly he would kind of get this little smile on his lips and he'd raise his hand and he would disembowel the speaker with some incredible set of questions. And so anyway, somebody like that kept his brain challenged until the day he died.
I think people who aren't scientists have a bigger challenge. And I think that's also why retirement hurts so many people.
That's exactly right. The key thing to seek in retirement is other people. There's actually nothing as challenging to the brain as other people. And that's simply because you never know what someone's going to say. Unlike all the other things we do, people are unpredictable. And so anyway, it's terrific for these, retirement communities, and I just think it's massively important. And unfortunately, what I see is often that's not what happens, because people retire, maybe their hearing's getting worse, whatever's going on. And so they feel like, well, other people are just too much trouble. I'm just not going to do that anymore.
I think that we've had a pretty good conversation, and I really enjoyed the book, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with my listeners and looking forward to seeing what you're going to write next.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm working on my next one now. It's a book about how we perceive reality and how different it is from person to person.
Yeah, that'll be good.
Well, thank you so much, Ginger. I really appreciate it.
I want to thank David Eagleman for taking the time to talk with us about his new book, LiveWired, The Inside Story of the Ever-Changing Brain. This book not only provides a great overview of our current understanding of brain plasticity, but it also shares original ideas about topics such as dreaming and memory. I highly recommend this book to listeners of all backgrounds. Before I review the key ideas from today's episode, I want to share a few brief announcements. First, I'd love to hear from you. You can email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Detailed show notes are available at brainsciencepodcast.com, along with episode transcripts and links to the entire back catalog. If you want to get show notes automatically every month, please sign up for the free Brain Science newsletter. Just text Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. That's Brain Science, all one word, to 55444. I've been creating Brain Science independently since 2006. If you want to learn how you can support my work, please go to brainsciencepodcast.com/donations. There are options for getting premium content, including ad-free versions of the show. Before I present my summary of today's episode, I want to highlight a couple of ideas that I think we may have missed during our conversation. One is that turning spikes into meaningful experience requires a feedback loop related to our actions. Eagleman did mention this when he talked about motor babbling, but I think that the importance was not emphasized. Also, we talked about the difference between the parts of the brain that seem to have become fixed or hardwired and those that remain flexible. This seems to relate to the amount of expected change. For example, sensory areas learn that the external world is predictable, while the body is constantly changing. There's also an important role for repetition. On page 140, Eagleman wrote, "Brain circuits come to reflect what you do." This requires active participation. It also has to relate to survival or reward signals. In other words, it has to be something relevant. On page 153, he wrote, "Without engagement, there is no plasticity." So that relates to this larger principle of relevance. Without motivation, there is no rewiring. So, for example, if you're a teacher, you know that inspiring curiosity is a key to learning. Another thing we talked about was the possibility that synapse change is not the only mechanism involved in memory. And I want to talk a little bit more about why Eagleman argues that changes in synapse are not enough. First, if only existing synapses changed, we would not expect to see the cortical changes that are demonstrated on brain imaging when people learn new skills or information, because you can't see changes at the level of the synapse in brain imaging. There would be no reason for neurogenesis, which has been proven to occur, and there would also be no epigenetic changes, which also occur. So LiveWired, The Inside Story of the Ever-Changing Brain by David Eagleman, has something for readers of all backgrounds. The term LiveWired captures the key idea that our brain is constantly changing its circuitry. While this is obviously essential to our survival, it sets the brain apart from the computers that have become a ubiquitous part of our daily lives. It also captures the equally important idea that our DNA does not provide a blueprint for the brain. It provides some basic instructions. But as Eagleman said, DNA is only half the secret of life. He said the other half is all around us because it's everything that we experience in the world. That's the thing that really wires our brains to be who we are. Textbooks give one the impression that the sensory and motor cortex are hardwired, but this is not exactly accurate. The brain actually learns to move whatever sort of body it has, And as the example of the dog who could walk on his hind legs showed, this is driven by the needs of the person or the animal. If a part of the cortex that is normally wired for a particular sensation or body part loses that input, it does not just do nothing, it takes on new functions. In fact, there appears to be an ongoing competition for cortical real estate. How is this flexibility possible? It gets back to those spikes that we talked about last month with Mark Humphreys. No matter what the original source, all information is translated into spikes or action potential. This means that a part of the brain that typically processes vision can process touch instead, for example. As Eagleman said, the brain just has to figure out what to do with the spikes. And as I mentioned a minute ago, this has to do with feedback. We talked quite a bit about sensory substitution, including the famous experiment where sighted people were blindfolded to learn Braille. The most surprising finding was how fast cortical change can occur, in under an hour. This is faster than the brain can create new connections, so it implies that previously inhibited connections have been activated. This has important implications, especially in the field of rehabilitation. Now, obviously, not all parts of the brain are equally flexible. The sensory areas become fixed over time, while motor areas and memory areas remain more flexible. Eagleman proposed that the key determinant may be the nature of the input. Once the brain learns the nature of visual information in the world, that's unlikely to change, but our body continues to change and grow, and it needs to be able to adapt. Memory is an obvious area where live wiring is critical, but the typical synaptic model of memory does not account for how human memory really works. Eagleman proposed an alternative pace level model where processes working on different timescales interact. It's really important to understand that living beings do not store memories the way a computer does. In a computer, each memory is independent, but our memories are always dependent on what has gone before. This is one reason why you and I will not have identical memories, even of experiences that we shared. Eagleman reminded us that keeping our brains flexible depends on presenting them with novelty. If our lives are totally predictable, our brain doesn't really have to be flexible. Since the brain is a prediction machine, it loves ruts, but we have to challenge it if we want it to remain flexible. One thing that stood out for me was his comment that the best thing we can do for our brain is interact with other people because people are always unpredictable. This puts an interesting spin on the data that shows how important social interaction is, along with the damaging effects of social isolation. This is something to keep in mind the next time you're tempted to avoid social interaction because it seems like too much work. That work is exactly what your brain needs. I want to end my summary with an overview of what I think are the key ideas of LiveWired, the inside story of the ever-changing brain. Neurons fight for territory and survival. The brain maps are not genetically prescripted, but are instead molded by input. Eagleman wrote, "Brains adjust to drive whatever body they find themselves in." This is on page 137. The rate of change influences whether a particular area remains plastic. Finally, each of us is the product of our interaction with the world, and human brains do not store memories the way computers do. Again, I highly recommend this book no matter what your background. Two final closing comments. I want to remind you that Brain Science has a free mobile app that is available for iOS, Android, and Windows phones. If you have the mobile app, you can access Dr. Eagleman's original interview from 2011 for free. Just look for the extras associated with episode 187. Also, I'd like to remind you about my book, Are You Sure? The Unconscious Origins of Certainty. I published the second edition last year. It's available at brainsciencepodcast.com and on all the major online bookstores like Amazon and Barnes & Noble. If you'd like to get an autographed copy, just email me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. Next month's episode will be an interview with Anil Seth about his new book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness. Until then, I hope you will check out my other podcasts, Books and Ideas, and Grain Rainbows. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Brain Science is copyright 2021 to Virginia Campbell, MD. You may copy it to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at brainsciencepodcast@gmail.com. The theme music for Brain Science is Mindfire, written and performed by Tony Catraccia. You can find his work at syncopationnow.com.